and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org, installment for September 24th, 2016. The show is broadcast throughout Northern California on KQMS 1670 AM, 99.3 FM, and 105.7 FM. It's a commercial-free news hour addressing the most dire issues we face. There are many, too many to cover in an hour of commercial-free news, but we'll try. The planet Earth continues to descend into the Easter Island scenario. That's what's playing out on our planet. And for those that aren't familiar with what happened on Easter Island, the inhabitants completely decimated their environment until they resorted to cannibalism and their entire civilization collapsed. It's exactly where we're heading. In regards to patriotism, as times get tougher, the very twisted, demented interpretation and practice of, quote, patriotism is truly baffling. Many consider it patriotic if they're willing to go to war and to die for what they perceive as to be their country's interests, but not enough are patriotic in the sense that they'll face the truth. And the blind, unquestioning patriotism is in fact not patriotism at all. It's nothing more than a groupthink, herd mentality form of cowardice. That's what blind patriotism is. Many from other countries that have been horrifically harmed by the U.S. interventions, for example, have amazingly remained benevolent toward the American population, choosing only to blame the actions of the government. But doesn't the American population bear the blame for standing idly by and allowing their government and military to do whatever the power structure wants while blindly waving their flags and pretending that they're patriotic? And again, is that what Americans think patriotism is all about? That might makes right? That we should believe whatever our government tells us through the channels of the completely controlled mainstream media weapon of mass deception and distraction? No, this is not the kind of blind allegiance that patriotism is about. As I already stated, that kind of patriotism is nothing more than cowardice. And in regards to the media, I know I'm jumping right into things here, but there's simply too much to cover not to do this. In regards to our media, recent studies show that 32% of Americans still trust the media. That's unfortunate because the media shouldn't be trusted at all. The media is nothing more than a weapon of mass distraction, as I've already stated. It's about time Americans wake up to that fact. But you have to want to wake up in order to wake up. Another headline on that point: Western media credibility in free fall collapse. And what do we have for a so-called media, by the way? The corporate-owned, power structure-controlled mainstream media, again, nothing short of what could be and should be considered an official ministry of propaganda for the global elite, period. That's what our media is, including our local media here in Northern California, KRCR and the Record Searchlight. And more data out this week, of course, that they won't cover or that they will spin as they're told to spin it at the cost of all of us. If you think that being fed a pack of lies from your local media won't affect you as the world crashes and burns, think again. What's our corporate-controlled, power structure-owned mainstream media propaganda sources not telling us this week? That's what this show is all about. Before headlines, I want to announce a former military medic whistleblower has given her full testimony on film to the Vaxxed crew, VAXXED, if you don't know what that is, if you're new to this show. This is a must-watch video and can be found on the Vaxxed website. And I've sent this video, it's about 17 minutes long, incredibly powerful testimony from a former military medic that gave vaccinations throughout her career in the military and is now coming clean that she knows those vaccinations were causing harm and she followed orders, and she clearly regrets that and showing tremendous courage to step forward now. She's already been visited by the men in black suits in the black suburbans. She gives an incredibly powerful testimony. And I sent this to many throughout Shasta County, including radio show hosts who have so far remained buried in total denial of the facts because they refuse to look at the facts. And we'll see if any of these radio show hosts has the courage to actually investigate, which so far hasn't happened. And some of these hosts are former military, and they're practicing the same kind of blind patriotism that I just described, which is nothing more than cowardice. Nothing more than cowardice to not investigate the facts, to blindly wave your flag without a clue what's going on and what's being done in your name. That's not patriotism, it's cowardice. On another issue I want to touch on before I get to headlines, about the most recent police shootings of African Americans. Certainly, that's a tragedy. And I hope those responsible are actually held responsible. But people on both sides of the fence, from law enforcement to the African American community, need to see that the media is doing everything they can, the power structure is doing everything they can to use these unfortunate occurrences as tools of total division, divide and conquer. So for the African American community, certainly I understand your sense of outrage at what's happened, but if in protest, if there is violence, if there is vandalism, then you are doing exactly what the power structure wants you to do. And when I see films of those who are breaking windows and burning cars, those are nothing more than criminal thugs doing that. And that's not how you sincerely protest what's happened, by breaking things and damaging things or harming others that maybe had nothing to do with the situation. And for the law enforcement community, responsibility needs to be shown there as well, to not provoke an already outraged community. And both are happening on both sides of the fence. And I hope that there's sanity prevails and that the law enforcement community and the African American community both see that these unfortunate occurrences, which I hope are dealt with by the full extent of the law, are still being used as wedges of division to try to distract while the power structure does whatever it wants around the globe. Gives them more weapons of control to allow them to drive this wedge between different segments of our community. Let sanity prevail. About headlines. The global meltdown continues, and this is all connected to the attempt to divide different parts of the American population, as I just outlined. Headlines. The Bank for International Settlements warns that a major debt meltdown in China is imminent. This process is continuing and it will accelerate. Another headline. Is Deutsche Bank cooking its derivatives book to hide huge losses? The answer is absolutely yes. The card house is coming down around the globe. Can't be hidden for much longer. Another headline. Is U.S. shale nearing collapse? The whole shale debacle, the whole pack of lies that was fed to us about shale being some infinite source of energy that would make America energy independent. Absolute lie. The shale oil wells, after they peak, collapse rapidly. It's already happening, not to mention the groundwater that's been contaminated everywhere from the facade of the shale boom that was merely an environmental cataclysm. It's unfolding now. Another headline, Norway sees oil production drop almost 10%. This is plummeting around the globe. If you think these numbers aren't significant, think again. Now, as the environment implodes again, economic activity, environmental implosion, directly connected. Another headline. These headlines are now coming fast and furious constantly for those who bought the lies that Arctic sea ice was not collapsing, that we're not heading into global meltdown. For those of you who bought those lies, I encourage you to look at real headlines. Look at frontline film footage so you don't need to believe anyone. And you can see firsthand what's happening on the front lines of the biosphere. Headline, sea ice record retreat has Antarctic experts worried for wildlife. Climate scientists fear a sharp reduction in Antarctic sea ice in recent weeks will impact marine life and climate system. Now I want to outline this. This is not the Arctic, which we knew was in full-blown implosion. This is Antarctica, which was the headline of choice for those who wanted to deny that the planet was in meltdown. Antarctic sea ice has gone from near record highs 2 years ago, which were really statistically manipulated highs with a lot of geoengineering and chemical ice nucleation. They've now plummeted to record lows in 2 years. The meltdown is real. Climate engineering is making it worse. Key points on that headline about Antarctic sea ice. Antarctic sea ice is retreating earlier than usual. Second point, instability of ice affecting access to research stations in Antarctica now, not just the Arctic. Third point, impacts expected on marine life and climate research. How could there not be impacts when Earth's biosystems implode? Of course, there'll be impacts. From this report, final statements. New daily records have been set for measuring the retreat of sea ice around Antarctica in the past week. Final statement from the report. The situation has forced the Australian Antarctic Division to rethink its upcoming expeditions due to the danger of heavy equipment breaking through the ice. Now, what's going on with sea level rise? Here's a headline. Sea level rise is already driving people from the Marshall Islands. That's the kind of frontline report that you don't need to believe anybody. We know NASA, NOAA, and many other agencies are not telling us the truth. But the fact is, the truth is much more dire than anything they're telling us. And if you look at frontline data, frontline film footage of islands going under, why do you need to believe anybody? If you don't believe your own eyes, there's nothing I or anyone else can tell you that will make you look at facts. Another headline, California's drought could continue for centuries. And this is the kind of lies we're getting from, quote, academia, our scientists, our experts, that we're told we should believe and trust. From this report, if you were hoping for a respite from California's drought on its 5th year, and it's not its 5th year, it's in its 9th year, that's because, according to a new study of UCLA, government-owned, bought and paid for university and their academicians with it, published in the Journal of Nature, California's drought could continue for centuries. So we're supposed to believe these academicians that are telling us it's just normal, as if it's some sort of natural cycle, without a single mention of climate engineering, which is the single greatest drought-causing factor on the planet Earth, period. Don't believe me? Look it up. Search geoengineering causes drought and see what you find. And how could we possibly give any credibility to any academician, any climate scientist, any meteorologist that won't admit to the geoengineering elephant in the room? On that note, for those like our local media, like the Record Searchlight, like KRCR, that paint the geoengineering issue as a, quote, silly conspiracy theory and refuse to put any credible data out about it because that's what they're paid to do, to lie. Here's an excerpt from a Committee on Science and Technology U.S. House of Representatives report at the 111th Congress. It's titled Geoengineering Parts 1, 2, and 3. First session and second session. From this report, U.S. House of Representatives report on geoengineering. I'm reading from the report. Only a small excerpt because the report is very extensive. It says, any effective large-scale modification of the climate will necessarily have global consequences, while the technical aspects of essentially every geoengineering method requires a great deal of additional research and examination. The legal, governmental, and socio-political and ethical issues may ultimately be greater challenges, obviously, because people would absolutely go ballistic if they knew climate engineering was going on, and our government knows that. Final statement from this report, this excerpt. There are several fundamental questions on geoengineering governance that would need to be addressed. Who decides what methods are being used? What regulatory mechanisms are there? And who establishes them? Who pays for the surveillance? Who decides our ultimate goals and the pace in which we go toward achieving them? While some international treaties or agreements may be applicable to certain geoengineering applications, there are currently, and listen to this, no regulatory framework in place aimed at geoengineering specifically. What's that mean? It means they can do whatever they want in our skies because there's no law to tell them they can't. By design, there's no law. This is from a House of Representatives report, and our local media continues to ignore any facts on this issue and continues to do everything they can to deceive the population on the validity of this issue. Final statement from this congressional report. Further, more Furthermore, several proposed geoengineering strategies may directly violate existing treaties. These frameworks may pose an additional challenge for geoengineering governance, but they may also provide guidance on ways to address the complex issues of jurisdiction and responsibility at an international scale. These programs have long since been internationally deployed. There's no regulations to in any way govern what's done in our skies. This is one of many governmental documents, and our local media continues to spew out disinformation on this issue. Another headline, world deforestation. We're losing a forest the size of New York City every 2 days. How many people think that can continue to go on? If that's what you think, you're living in a delusion. We're completely sacking the planet. Trees are dying all over the globe. We've lost 55% of Earth's total tree populations since the dawn of civilization, and the rest are very, very sick, dying, poor health. You don't have to look too hard driving around even Reading to see that. Going to the forest. If you don't know what a tree should look like or you've forgotten, look at some old pictures and look at what they used to look like and take a look at what our trees look like now throughout Reading. Drive through parking lots and look at the sick, dead, dying, burnt to a crisp from the intense UV trees happening all over the globe. And the bioavailable toxic heavy metals coming down in our precipitation, and we have the lab tests to prove this, metals that match climate engineering patents exactly, are poisoning the root systems of the trees. Science study bears this out. Now, if this was really happening, wouldn't the EPA, for example, sound the alarm? Because that's what public protection agencies are for, aren't they? But as I've said in so many previous shows, agencies like the EPA exist to cover the tracks of the corporate world. They exist to hide threats from the public, not to disclose them. Along those lines, here's a headline. EPA plans to allow unlimited dumping of fracking wastewater in the Gulf of Mexico. Is that protecting us? I think not. From this report, in a letter sent to EPA officials on Monday, attorneys for the Center for Biological Diversity warned that the agency's draft permit for water pollution discharges in the Gulf fails to consider how dumping wastewater containing chemicals from fracking and acidizing operations would impact water quality and marine life. You think it would be hard to figure that out? EPA doesn't know that? Of course they know. Their job is to do whatever the corporate world wants them to do. Final statement from that report. Under the EPA's current and draft permits, offshore drillers are allowed to dump unlimited amounts of fracking chemicals overboard as long as they're mixed with the wastewater that returns from undersea wells. How does that help anything? Oil and gas platforms dumped more than 75 billion gallons of these chemicals directly into the Gulf of Mexico in 2014 alone. Think about that. If you think these federal agencies are there to protect you, you're delusional. You're not looking at the facts. You're uninformed. So how bad is the climate getting? We have this trashing of our environment from every direction. The forests are being lopped down, planets being paved, 100 million tons of CO2 going in the atmosphere every day, climate engineering, destroying the ozone layer, trapping more heat than it deflects, completely decimating the hydrological cycle. How warm is it now? August, again, was the 16th consecutive month of record-breaking global heat. 16 months now in a row, each month warmer than the last. We're in a runaway scenario right now, and climate engineering is making it worse, not better. So what happens when the power structure, again, becomes desperate? It's the same scenario I've outlined before, but it's important for people to understand where we're heading. As the blatant assault on the biosphere has now decimated the planet to the point where it's collapsing, the power structure becomes imminently more desperate and dangerous and destructive. And our war machine, the war machine for the United States of America, is completely out of control. The military-industrial complex. Other countries are as well, to a great degree, but by far the most powerful military in the world is, of course, the United States of America, the biggest military machine, the basis on which the country's economy is being kept afloat to a certain degree. So as the biosphere implodes, what do we see happening around the globe that is a sign of that desperation? headline, Saudis using U.S.-supplied white phosphorus in Yemen. U.S.-supplied white phosphorus. This is a weapon that's banned for wartime use, and they're using it. A horrible weapon. Absolutely horrific weapon. Not that there is any good weapon, but we're supplying this kind of material around the globe. Why? Because it funds the war machine, as I went over last week. When we have Wolf Blitzer, and I question if that's his real name, Wolf Blitzer, CNN anchor, former AIPAC lobbyist, stating on the record to Rand Paul that Rand Paul shouldn't be worried about the morality of selling Saudi Arabians weapons. He should be worried about the jobs that will be lost if we don't sell them these weapons. And that's the sort of mindset that's prevalent in the halls of our government. Another headline on that note, Senate approves sale of $1.5 billion in weapons to Saudi Arabia. I go over this every week because it keeps happening. There's been about $100 billion plus of weapons sold to Saudi Arabia, and that just continues. Saudi Arabia is a brutal dictatorship, period. But we don't hear about that in the news much, do we? And another headline along the same theme, 27 U.S. senators rebel against arming Saudi Arabia. Covered part of that last week, but that saga continues. And who do we have protecting Saudi Arabia? Another headline, Obama promises to shield Saudis on 9/11. How about that? That's what we have, our government in bed with the Saudi Arabians. It's not about morality here. It's simply about empire and alliances to that empire. That's all it's about. And as this has continued, and this is business as usual, because we were friends with Saddam Hussein, in case anybody has forgotten that, right up until the point when Saddam Hussein wanted to sell oil in currency other than dollars, and then he became our enemy. When Gaddafi wanted to start trading oil in currency other than US dollars, he was taken out. This is what's happening. And we have, going back even further, again, the grand chessboard with Brzezinski, the advisor to all presidents going back to Johnson, and his outline for American control over Eurasia. All of this is part of the plan. Here's a headline that plugs into everything I just outlined. America's worldwide impunity. The mainstream U.S. media is treating the U.S.-led airstrike that killed scores of Syrian troops as an unfortunate accident, ignoring that the U.S. and its allies have no legal right to operate in Syria to begin with. More on that story in a moment, because that's a very critical story that outlines the sort of tyranny that I'm trying to point out here. Another headline, Syria ceasefire collapses in wake of weakened U.S. airstrikes. The airstrike I just mentioned, killing the Syrian troops. When Russia, this is the third headline, when Russia called to get the U.S. to stop the Syrian airstrike, the U.S. official, the appropriate official, wasn't there to answer the phone. From that report, weakened U.S. airstrikes against Syrian army base, a protracted error which killed, this report says, 83 Syrian soldiers, and opened up the base, this is key, and opened up the base for ISIS to overrun it. Carried on longer than it should have, because when Russia made the call to warn the Americans, the U.S. official who was supposed to answer the call wasn't there. I've gone over again and again, week after week, that the U.S. claims to be fighting ISIS, even though it has spawned, fueled, and funded ISIS, and continues to protect ISIS, continues to help ISIS. And I'm going to get more into the scenario as this show goes on. So we had, again, the U.S. looking the other way when Turkey was purchasing oil from ISIS, which helped fund ISIS. We have the largest, most powerful military in the world, the U.S. military, that seems to be unable to handle ISIS, and I don't believe that at all. They're simply not allowed to deal with ISIS. And our military brothers and sisters need to face that fact as well. We know our military could deal with a bunch of these disorganized people with Toyota pickup trucks, which, by the way, were purchased by the Pentagon, in case you forgot that from a previous show. The Toyota trucks that you see the ISIS armies driving around in were purchased by the Pentagon. How many signs do we need? And now we have the Syrian ceasefire that was violated when the U.S. killed a primary Syrian, or bombed a primary Syrian base, killing almost 100 Syrian soldiers that allowed ISIS to then take over more ground. This gets even worse as I go. Bear with me. Because the bottom line with Syria, and I'll get to this core point in a moment, why did the whole Syrian conflict happen to begin with? Certainly not what we've been told. Before I get to that headline, I want to remind everyone, does anyone even remember the constant flow of fabricated lies about Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction? Anyone remember the fabricated lies about Saddam being connected with 9/11, which he wasn't? What about the lies issued to garner public support for dozens of other U.S. NATO invasions and illegal occupations over recent decades? What about the Vietnam War that was started from the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is now known historically to be a false flag event created by our own government? And 60,000 of our sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, died in that war, almost 60,000. How many Americans care about that? We should all be heartbroken over the tragedy. And how many innocent civilians died in Vietnam? I think 2 or 3 million. How many are still dying there from the war ordinance that's still there, from the fallout of Agent Orange, which also killed our own troops? Those who run our government don't give a damn about who they harm. And it's about time we wake up to that fact. So why are we in Syria? What's the real reason we're in Syria? Here's a headline, Assad's death warrant. This is a report by Mike Whitney. Great report, by the way. Here's why we're in Syria. Secret cables and reports by the U.S., Saudi, and Israeli intelligence agencies indicate that the moment Assad rejected the Qatari pipeline, a pipeline through his country, military and intelligence planners quickly arrived at the consensus that fomenting a Sunni uprising in Syria to overthrow the uncooperative Bashar Assad was a feasible path to achieving the shared objective of completing the Qatar-Turkey gas link. In 2009, according to WikiLeaks, soon after Bashar Assad rejected the Qatar pipeline, the CIA began funding opposition groups in Syria. This is business as usual. Same thing with Saddam, same thing with Gaddafi, same thing with anyone who doesn't go along with the military-industrial complex plans. They're taken out. It's not about freedom and democracy, and our military brothers and sisters have to wake up to that fact. They're simply being used as mercenaries for those in power. Period. And the whole Syrian conflict, which may lead us very soon to World War III, because those who run our country do whatever they want because the American people let them do whatever they want while they wave their flags blindly in a twisted, demented form of patriotism that has nothing to do with the true sense of the word. Continuing with this report, the conflict in Syria is not a war in the conventional sense of the word. It's a regime change operation, just like Libya and Iraq. I just went over that. Or regime change operations. The main driver of the conflict in the country that's toppled more than 50 sovereign governments since the end of World War II. I've been over that in recent shows numerous times. 50 sovereign governments since the end of World War II. We're talking about the United States, of course. Washington is this is from the report still, Washington is the hands-down regime change champion. No one else even comes close. That being the case, one might assume that the American people would notice the pattern of intervention and see through the propaganda and assign blame accordingly. But that never seems to happen, and it probably won't happen here either. No matter how compelling the evidence may be, the brainwashed American people always believe their government is doing the right thing. This is all from the report, but it's true. It's unfortunately true, and I hope that changes. Continuing with the report, but the United States is not doing the right thing in Syria. Arming, training, and funding Islamic extremists that have killed 500,000 people, displaced 7 million more, and turned the country into an uninhabitable wasteland. This is not the right thing. It's the wrong thing, the immoral thing, and the U.S. is involved in this conflict for all the wrong reasons, the foremost of which is gas. The U.S. wants to install a puppet regime in Damascus so it can secure pipeline corridors in the east, oversee the transport of vital energy reserves from Qatar to the EU, and make sure that those reserves continue to be dominated in U.S. dollars that are recycled into U.S. treasuries and U.S. financial assets. This is the basic recipe for maintaining U.S. dominance in the Middle East and for extending America's imperial grip on global power into the future. The grand chessboard that I've been over again and again, and this is what Syria is about. This is what triggered the whole conflict. The refusal of Assad to allow the corporate military-industrial complex power structure to run a pipeline through his country. That's what it's about. More from this report. The war in Syria did not begin when the government of Bashar Assad cracked down on protesters in the spring of 2011. That version of events is pure propaganda. Again, the war began in 2009 when Assad rejected a Qatari plan to transport gas from Qatar to the EU via Syria. I want to read a statement from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in an article he wrote titled "Syria, Another Pipeline War." This is from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The $10 billion, 1,500-kilometer pipeline through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Turkey would have linked Qatar directly to European energy markets via distribution terminals in Turkey. The Qatar-Turkey pipeline would have given the Sunni kingdoms of the Persian Gulf decisive dominance over the world of natural gas markets and strengthened Qatar, America's closest ally in the Arab world. In 2009, this is continuing from the Kennedy report. In 2009, Assad announced that he would refuse to sign the agreement to allow the pipeline to run through Syria. Naturally, the Saudis, Qataris, Turks, and Americans were furious at Assad, but what could they do? How could they prevent him from choosing his own business partners and using his own sovereign territory to transport gas to market? Again, that's what this conflict is about. That's what all these Middle East adventures are about. It's about resources, going all the way back to 9/11. Without 9/11, the American population would be much more awake instead of blindly following whatever those in power dictate. 9/11 was the catalyst that allowed the floodgates to open with the military-industrial complex interventions in the Middle East. Continuing from this report, Washington and its scheming allies decided to launch a clandestine proxy war against Damascus to kill or depose Assad and make damn sure the Western oil giants got the future pipeline contracts and controlled the flow of energy to Europe. That was the plan. I want to read another quote from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Quote, "Secret cables and reports by the U.S., Saudi, and Israeli intelligence agencies indicate that the moment Assad rejected the Qatari pipeline, military intelligence planners quickly arrived at the consensus that fomenting a Sunni uprising in Syria to overthrow the uncooperative Bashar al-Assad was a feasible path to achieving the shared objective of completing the Qatar-Turkey gas link in 2009. Again, according to WikiLeaks. I want to repeat that again. The moment Assad rejected the Qatari pipeline, he signed his own death warrant. That single act was the catalyst for the U.S. aggression that transformed a 5,000-year-old civilization into a desolate, Fallujah-like moonscape overflowing with homicidal fanatics that were recruited, groomed, and deployed by various allied intelligence agencies. Think about that. The American population is being told again and again and again how much we need to fear ISIS, and they're a brutal group. There's no question about that. But who is fueling and funding them and continuing to protect them? With the most glaring recent example of that being the moment there was a Syrian ceasefire put into place, the United States and its allies bombed Syrian soldiers who were fighting ISIS and thus provided the cover, the opening, for ISIS to take even more ground, a very important strategic location. Are these accidents? Think again. Think again. What's particularly interesting, continuing from this report, what's particularly interesting about the story is that the U.S. attempted a nearly identical plan 60 years earlier during the Eisenhower administration. Here's another clip from Kennedy. Quote, "During the 1950s, President Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers mounted a clandestine war against the Arab nationalism, which the CIA director, Alan Dulles, equated with communism, particularly when Arab self-rule threatened oil concessions back to the resources. They pumped secret American military aid to tyrants in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, favoring puppets with conservative jihadist ideologies, which they regarded as reliable, fueling the terrorists." This is not new. It's not new. Continuing from the report, the CIA began its active meddling in Syria in 1949, barely a year after the agency's creation. Syria's democratically elected president hesitated to approve the Trans-Arabian pipeline, an American project intended to connect the oil fields of Saudi Arabia to the ports of Lebanon. The CIA engineered a coup, replacing al-Kuwaiti with the CIA's hand-picked dictator who barely had time to dissolve parliament and approve the American pipeline before his country deposed him 14 weeks into his regime. This model is not new. It's business as usual. That's why so many countries have been toppled by U.S. intervention, whether overt or covert. It's time for the American people to start looking at facts. How far do we have to go down this road? How much carnage has to happen? And we're heading toward World War III now. We are absolutely heading toward World War III. And if those who doubt that, those who want to ram their heads in the sand and wave their flags and pretend that their government can do no wrong, look up. You're being sprayed by your own government. It's astounding to me, even many people who know that things like the aerosol spraying is going on, geoengineering, climate engineering, and how toxic it is, somehow still believe other things our government says. They still pretend what's happening in the Middle East is somehow about freedom and democracy, which couldn't be further from the truth. How many lies do we have to be exposed before American citizens, a larger majority of them, start to behave responsibly and start to display some sort of sign of true patriotism, which involves primarily looking at the truth and acting on the truth and not ideology. Final excerpts from this report. The CIA money failed to corrupt the Syrian military. This is on the subsequent coup they tried to create in Syria. The soldiers reported the CIA's bribery attempts to the Ba'athist regime. In response, the Syrian army invaded the American embassy. They captured a CIA agent named Stone. Stone was interrogated, made a television confession to his roles in the Iranian coup and the CIA's aborted attempt to overthrow Syria's legitimate government. Syria then purged all politicians sympathetic to the U.S. Why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? History is repeating itself from this report still. It's like the CIA was too apathetic to even write a new script. They just dusted off the old one and hired new actors. As I finish the last paragraphs of this report, again, consider all the propaganda we've been fed by mainstream media and then plug in these dots of verifiable history and see which you think fits. Final paragraphs of this report. Fortunately, Assad, with the help of Iran, Hezbollah, and the Russian Air Force, has fended off the effort to oust him and install a U.S. stooge. This should not be taken as a ringing endorsement of Assad as leader. Nobody's endorsing Assad. We're simply explaining what happened. But here's the bottom line. The principle that global security depends on basic protections of national sovereignty and that the cornerstone of international law has to be a rejection of unprovoked aggression, whether the hostilities are executed by one's own military or by armed proxies that are used to achieve the same strategic objectives while invoking plausible deniability. The fact is, there's no difference between Bush's invasion of Iraq and Obama's invasion of Syria. The moral, ethical, and legal issues are the same. The only difference is that Obama has been more successful in confusing the American people about what's really going on. Final paragraphs of this report. And what's going on is regime change. Quote, Assad must go. That's been the administration's mantra from the beginning. Obama and co. are trying to overthrow the democratically elected secular regime that refuses to bow to Washington's demands to provide access to pipeline corridors that will further strengthen U.S. dominance in the region. Why would they allow that, given all that we know about what the U.S. has done in the Middle East? Final paragraphs in this report. That's what's really going on behind the ISIS distraction and the Assad is brutal dictator, quote, distraction, and the war-weary civilians in Aleppo distraction. Washington doesn't care about any of those things. What Washington cares about is oil, power, and money. How can anyone be confused about that at this point? Kennedy summed it up like this. We must recognize the Syrian conflict is a war over control of resources, indistinguishable from the myriad of clandestine and undeclared oil wars we have been fighting in the Middle East for 65 years. And only when we see this conflict as a proxy war over a pipeline do events become comprehensible. That's the bottom line. Back to what I outlined near the beginning of this show. What the U.S. has done to be sure that the conflict in Syria continues to escalate. Again, instead of ISIS, U.S.-led bombing kills nearly 100 Syrian soldiers fighting them. So the U.S. bombing did not kill any ISIS fighters. It killed the fighters that are fighting ISIS. And to reiterate again, deadly airstrikes on a key unit battling Islamic State militants, described as perhaps the single biggest blunder of the U.S. war in Syria. Was it a blunder? Or was it a calculated move? From this report, an emergency UN Security Council meeting was called, and an already tenuous ceasefire agreement was now brought to a halt. At the time this report was made, it was classified as being under strain. The U.S.-led coalition bombers on Saturday, this is last Saturday, killed nearly 100 Syrian army officers who were battling Islamic fighters near the airport in eastern Syria. Early reporting indicated that between 62 and 90 Syrian troops have been killed in U.S.-led airstrikes. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a UK-based monitoring group with contacts across Syria, cited sources at the airport saying at least 90 Syrian soldiers had been killed and 120 wounded. A statement released by the U.S. Central Command acknowledged that the airstrikes had been carried out in the area, claiming coalition aircraft believed they were targeting ISIS units. Really? Do we believe that they believe that? But said that the bombing was halted immediately when coalition officials were informed by Russian officials that it was possible the personnel and vehicles targeted were part of the Syrian army. Do we really think the Russians knew and we didn't know? We really didn't know we were bombing Syrian officials? And how conveniently does that play into the whole outline of everything I went over? The goal is to topple the democratically elected government, and the use of terrorists to do that has always been the plan. And is it just an accident, again, that this very key outpost of Syrian soldiers was bombed, opening the door for ISIS to take control of yet more territory? Continuing from this report, the mass casualty bombing comes less than a week after the start of a ceasefire brokered by the U.S. and Russia, whose stated purpose was to allow aid convoys, get to more of a point on that in a moment, to reach besieged areas while also separating various rebel factions in hopes that further progress could be made towards long-term political negotiations. Now, first let me back up. Isn't it interesting that as soon as the U.S. made this unbelievable act of aggression to bomb Syrian soldiers instead of ISIS, how convenient was it that we had the bombs go off in New York? The total media distraction that kept this event out of view for almost all Americans. Isn't it convenient that whenever the power structure needs a distraction to cover up their acts of aggression, it happens again and again and again? So we have the convenient trash can bombings that completely eclipsed this act of aggression. That to see John Kerry talk about this was truly appalling. He had no remorse. He simply shrugged it off as, oops, sorry, mistake. Killed nearly 100 Syrian soldiers, wounded 120. Soldiers that are fighting ISIS. The people that run our government are nothing more than a criminal cabal, period. They're completely out of control. And if you think as an American citizen they care about you, you're living in a delusion. From every imaginable direction, the power structure is pulling the noose around our collective necks. From GMO foods to vaccinations that will soon be forced vaccinations if the American public does not stand up and say no. Vaccinations that are known to be harmful. That again, we have a military medic now on the record, testimony I talked about earlier in this show, to the fracking insanity that's poisoning groundwater throughout the entire country and the planet as a whole, to the ongoing aerosol spraying operations in our skies, the climate engineering, solar radiation management operations that is nothing less than weather warfare, because they are cutting off the rain to the western U.S. There's no question about that. We have satellite imagery to prove it. They're blanket spraying in the storm track upstream from the western U.S., especially California, which completely disintegrates any storm formation. We know this is happening. The science bears this out. Science study bears this out on the effect of atmospheric aerosolization. And these particles rain down on all of us, and we're inhaling them. And the heavy metals in these particles are synergistically toxic with heavy metals in vaccinations, for example. And we now have recent studies to prove that not just aluminum, but massive mercury contamination has now been acknowledged across the entire western U.S., and we think it's elsewhere as well. But this report has just been published. And with everything I say, I never ask anyone to believe me, but I do ask you to investigate. And if you don't investigate, then you're simply shirking your responsibility as a human being on this planet, period. As an American citizen, as a parent, if you're a parent, we have a responsibility to the greater good. And that responsibility doesn't involve ramming our heads in the sand, believing the official narrative on everything, the mainstream media propaganda machine that pumps out disinformation at a pace that's unimaginable, disinformation that's repiped by our local media here in Northern California, so-called media like the Record Searchlight and KRCR and others. We sent, as I mentioned, with geoengineering issues, vaccination issues, we sent press releases to A News Cafe, KRCR, Record Searchlight, all of which were ignored, and they will continue to do what they're paid to do by the power structure, which is pump out disinformation, period. Back to Syria, and again, the importance of Syria can't be overstated, because this is the proxy war that could lead to World War III very, very quickly. That involves all of us. In fact, it's not just could lead to World War III, it will lead to World War III if the current course continues. As I've been over in so many previous shows, the collapse of the biosphere means the collapse of the facade of a global economy that's based on perpetual growth on a finite planet with finite resources. That paradigm must collapse with the biosphere, and it is collapsing, and that makes the power structure incredibly desperate, incredibly dangerous. It's playing out in Syria right now. If you want the truth, you have to go elsewhere besides mainstream media. It's imperative you understand that. I want to finish this report about the Syrian troops. Those troops have been defending the area, as I stated earlier, from ISIS, who quickly overran what was left of the base's defenses and are now even closer to the Deir al-Zor airport. The airport has been one of the last major government holdouts in the capital, and at times the Syrian warplanes flying out of the airport were the only thing keeping ISIS from overrunning the entire eastern half of the country. The U.S. airstrikes seriously softened up the defenses in the area and might finally do what years of ISIS offenses couldn't do, put ISIS in control of the airport. That's what the U.S. just did. By bombing the Syrian defenses in the airport, perhaps they've put ISIS in control of that airport. The U.S. continues to help ISIS, not to hamper or harm or beat them back or to crush them. They're helping ISIS. John McCain standing with ISIS leaders. ISIS army driving U.S. purchased Toyota trucks, purchased from the Pentagon. Investigate everything I'm saying. Weapons flowing into the hands of ISIS, weapons from the U.S. Connect the dots. Back to the pipeline, the real reason for the entire Syrian conflict. Arming of terrorists, not a new model. Goes back 60 years, as I already outlined. Same model again and again and again. And how can they use the same model over and over and over? Because the American population has the shortest memory on the planet. They simply want to be distracted with every imaginable means of occupying themselves besides facing the truth and taking a stand for the common good. And if we don't change our behavior, we will be at the end of the road soon, period. From countless directions. It's not just one link in the chain that's going to drop out. The whole chain is going to disintegrate. The reality we've known is done. Now, the response to this, and this shows unimaginable arrogance on the part of the U.S. and its representatives. The response to the Syria troop annihilation by U.S. Permanent Representative to the UN Samantha Power was truly astounding. Unimaginable arrogance that she would call it a stunt for other nations around the globe to want an emergency United Nations meeting on this unimaginable aggression against the Syrian troops. So here's the headline around this story. Samantha Power calls emergency meeting a stunt, blasts Russia and Assad. Now first, how can it be a stunt when we have nations that are concerned about American aggression that just killed nearly 100 soldiers that were fighting the terrorism organization that America claims to be itself fighting, an event that could move us closer toward World War III, and the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, calls the need for such a meeting a stunt? From this report, the United Nations ambassador to the UN, the United States ambassador to the UN took an arrogant tone during the emergency meeting on Saturday, accusing Russia of bombing civilians. Now, isn't that interesting? The U.S. just bombed innocent soldiers that were fighting ISIS, and then immediately they want to point the finger back at someone else, and blaming the Assad regime for the rise of ISIS, calling the meeting grandstanding, quote, a stunt and a game, after 80 Syrian forces were killed in a U.S.-led airstrike. So, with everything I've outlined, with the knowledge that the whole Syrian aggression was about a pipeline, and we have this incredible arrogance which all our media repipes to continue the delusion of the American population that everything our country does is good, everything everyone else does is bad, the delusion that this is all about freedom and democracy, when it couldn't be further from the truth. It's about resources. It's always been about resources, and our military brothers and sisters need to wake up to this fact. Again, as I've stated over and over, they're being used for mercenaries for those in power. I need to wrap a few more dots up before I run out of time. So, what's happened since the Syrian soldiers were bombed? A UN convoy has now been bombed, and with no facts whatsoever, the U.S. immediately, and the media quotes the U.S. military, anything they say without verification of any facts at all, that the strike on the convoy was Russia. Why would Russia or Syria bomb an aid convoy that they did everything to ensure would happen to begin with? That the ceasefire would happen, that the aid convoys would happen. This is completely counterintuitive, and there is no proof whatsoever of any Russian involvement or Syrian involvement, but yet U.S. military leaders, just like they did after 9/11, with no facts at all, blaming Saddam Hussein, which we now know had nothing to do with 9/11. Same situation here. So the aggression continues, the aid convoy is bombed, the ceasefire is brought to a halt, and the U.S. media parrots anything, everything the U.S. military-industrial complex says verbatim, no fact check, and the American population gulps it down, no questions asked, because they want to believe a lie. They want to believe a lie. They don't want to wake up. The wake-up's coming one way or another. Wait and see. No way around it. The reality we've known is done, and we are on the fast track to World War III and total global extinction from countless directions, not just from nuclear exchanges, but from biosphere implosion. So here's the final dots in the picture for today. Now the U.S. is pushing, since the aid convoy was bombed, they're pushing for a no-fly zone over Syria, which would in effect give ISIS a huge helping hand by eliminating the threat of attack from Syrian and Russian air forces. The U.S. is proposing that only the so-called coalition air power be allowed to fly over Syria. A sovereign nation. How convenient. Bottom line, if you're caught up in the election facade, if you're caught up in politics at all, if you're distracted by sports games, materialistic pursuits, or any belief system that makes you feel you don't have any responsibility toward the greater good, you're completely off course and missing the point. We'll all sink or swim together. If we care at all about our children, our primary responsibility must be, to face the truth on all fronts and to do our part to correct the course of certain suicide that we're all currently on. What will each of us choose to do with the time we've been allotted on this planet? Make your voice heard for the greater good. This is Dane Wigington. Until next week.
Adventures on the Tracks you can catch every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.